Under the silver glow of a bone-white moon, a child's life dangled between breath and silence. Venom surged through her veins, her tiny body convulsing, and the rancher's rough hands shook uselessly at his sides. Then came the man the town had always distrusted, a Cherokee doctor with nothing but roots, prayers, and the memory of his grandmother's voice. He didn't ask for thanks, didn't ask for a promise. He only asked for the chance to save her life, and he did. But in towns like this, mercy was never free. By morning, whispers would ripple across the streets: tradition, debt, honor. They said a healer who saved a child must be bound to her family, sealed not with coin, but with ritual marriage. Now imagine the weight of that choice. A man who knelt to save a girl out of love for life itself, suddenly told his compassion had written him into a story he never asked for. A father torn between gratitude and pride. A daughter who only wanted her healer to stay close. And a town ready to twist salvation into ceremony. In the pale blue glow of moonlight, a child's final breath trembled in the still night air, quivering like a fragile ember fighting its last flicker beneath a blanket of silence that felt colder than death itself. This was the moment when the Cherokee doctor arrived, his boots stirring dust on the dry ranch soil, his heart pounding. In echo of the trembling body he hurried to, and right there, under the ghostly glow of a lone pruned cottonwood, he cupped the ranch owner's daughter between soot-smudged hands, guided by centuries of healing whispered through his blood story. Of kindness, mercy, tragedy, survival, stitched into his every gesture. And I invite you now, as the story unfolds in your mind, to hold your breath with me, to lean into the shudder of fear and the faint glimmer of hope that trembles in that hush after such a violent bite. That moment, right at the edge of loss, is where our journey begins. And if you feel your chest tighten, your eyes welling, your heart yearning for her life to hang, and then to swing back toward salvation, then leave a silent promise in the comments below, or let that tiny spark of emotion kindle a voice to subscribe, because stories like this, born in shadow and bound by love, need witnesses. And here, in this wash of moonlight and dust, in that child's ragged inhale, lies the fragile golden filament of mercy that will bind the rest of our tale. My call to you isn't loud, isn't flashy. It is in the way your breath catches at the edge of that line, in the quiet audience of your heartbeat, because this isn't just a story about a snakebite or a doctor. This is about the fragile tethers of family, the fierce demand of healing, the murmur of gratitude that can't be voiced, the unspoken debt that lingers between healer and healed. And there, in that single blade of lunar illumination, the ranch owner's daughter lay, skin rising and falling in feverish rhythm, a blossom wilting under a venom that had already woven its poison through her veins. And the doctor knelt beside her, praying silently to ancestors' names he dared not speak aloud, his calloused fingers pressed above the wound, his breath shallow with the weight of responsibility. And you can feel it, can't you, that rawness, that fear of losing someone precious, that longing for salvation so deep your throat clenches with the need to cry out for mercy. And he checks for pulse with trembling determination, hears it feeble but alive, and in that heartbeat is the fragile hinge on which the whole ranch, the whole community, tilts, because if this child, the daughter who chases late summer fireflies across fields, is lost, then something vital unravels in the hearts of the people who love her, something that cannot be easily mended. But if she lives, it will be not just medicine that saves her, but the courage and quiet grace of a healer, who saw not difference but shared fragility, not alien but human. And in that cusp of fragility and hope, with breath of sweet alfalfa scent mingling with sweat and stirred soil, with her father's ragged inhalation close by and the night pressing in soft and dark, the Cherokee doctor draws on every memory of his grandmother's whispered chants, every memory of rivers running cool with life, every memory of the old stories of healing trees and hands made wise by earth and prayer. All she can offer is that There's no loud fanfare, no doctor's bag of miracles, only instinct, care, and love. But isn't that enough sometimes? Sometimes when death hovers close, sometimes that alone is the holy thing we lean on. And as he applies crude poultice and murmurs soothing words that are less Cherokee tongue than lullaby, you feel the weight pressing down on him. A man who carries two worlds, modern, unwritten medicine and the ancient whisper of earthbound wisdom, and you sense in that silent night that he is offering not just cure, but belonging, a presence that says, you are not alone. And there, in the hush around that moonlit scene, we plant the seed of the journey ahead, one of healing, of cultural crossroads, of love that doesn't need contracts, and of choices that bind and free at once. So keep this moment with you. Hold it in your chest. Let it course through your anticipation of what comes next. For every beat of that tiny pulse carries the potential for redemption or despair. And as that is all placed into the hands of one man's quiet faith, your heart should be leaning in now, should be already aching, already hopeful, and already wondering, can this child be saved? Will the man kneeling at the edge of death's shadow find the power to lean her back toward breath, toward life, toward laughter in morning sun? You, if you're sitting on the edge of your seat, if your own breath has still not quite returned, that means our story has begun right where it needed to. And what waits ahead is not just a tale of danger and rescue, but a crossroads of mercy, heritage, redemption, and perhaps something deeper still. And so as the Cherokee doctor pressed a palm gently over the wound, feeling the rapid fire of her heartbeat drumming too fast, too fragile beneath skin already flushed with fever, he whispered, not words of magic, not spells from forgotten tongues, but breath-laced prayers to the land itself, to the memory of his grandfather's steady hands and his grandmother's calming voice, as if calling back every life he'd helped save and everyone he hadn't, folding them into the desperate movements of this moment. For this child's face was no longer just another patient's. It was the echo of every soft-eyed youth he'd seen fade into stillness too soon. Every little one who had clutched at him in fear, only to grow quiet when the pain overtook them. But she was not quiet now, no. Her whimpers pierced the night like a broken bird's cry. Sharp, wet, human, and her father, a man hardened by decades of sun-baked earth and cattle screams, stood helpless, tears collecting in his beard like dew, hands shaking useless at his sides, his gun belt dangling limp on his hip, powerless against a snake he couldn't shoot. And in that shattering helplessness something inside him cracked, just a little, something that made him look at the doctor not as the other, not as the stranger whose blood ran different from his, but as the only thread still tying his daughter to the living world. The doctor worked fast, years of practice slipping into motion like a remembered dance. He sliced the skin with a steady blade, sucked and spat the venom, packed the wound with a poultice of tobacco, ash, and crushed root he carried always in a pouch stitched from deer hide, a relic from his own mother's hands. And when he tied it off, tight but not cruel, he finally met the girl's eyes, fever glazed but locked on his face as if trying to memorize it for the final time. And he whispered in Cherokee, not expecting her to understand, but needing to say it anyway, needing to speak the words his grandmother had said over him when he'd fallen once, sick with fever and too small to survive. Your breath belongs to the stars yet. And her eyelids fluttered. A twitch, a shift, and he saw it. The beginning of the fight in her chest, the body refusing surrender. Dawn was still hours away, the chill deepening, but there beside the porch steps stained with drops of her blood, a flicker of warmth pulsed in the earth like a thank you. Her father dropped to his knees then, one hand on his daughter's brow, the other clutching the doctor's arm, rough palm against lean muscle. And he didn't say thank you, not in that moment, because he didn't know how to say it without breaking down, but his eyes, those glassy, sun-worn eyes, said it 100 times. Said it like a drowning man gasping his first breath, and the doctor, exhausted, nodded once, silent, already thinking of the next hours, the danger not yet past, already calculating doses, water, fever checks, already hearing the judgment of townsfolk whose voices would surely rise by sunrise. What's he doing with that child? Why didn't we call Doc Turner? Isn't he just a tracker? But in this moment, none of that mattered. Only her breath mattered. Only her skin cooling slowly under his care. Only the way her small fingers twitched toward his, in semi-conscious gratitude. And as the moon dipped lower in the sky, bleeding its last silver over the tips of dry grass and the curved edges of barn roof, he eased her into her father's arms, careful not to jostle the wound, then sat back on his heels, shoulders slumped with fatigue, and stared out across the field, toward the creek that marked the edge of the ranch, where cottonwoods rustled like gossiping ghosts, and thought about how strange it was, how the lives of strangers could collide under such cruel, intimate circumstances, how mercy did not ask who you were before giving itself away, how sometimes the oldest lessons from the mountains and forests came down to one thing: do what you can, and let the earth decide the rest. Behind him, the father carried the girl inside, calling for blankets, water, something, anything, and the doctor remained seated on the ground, fingers stained with blood and root paste, throat dry, chest tight not just from exhaustion but from the memory of the little girl's eyes, how she'd looked at him like he was both monster and angel, like she wanted to live so badly she'd let a stranger carry her back from the edge of whatever dark place she was slipping into. A coyote yipped in the distance, one sharp bark, a lonely note on the quiet plain, and he realized the wind had shifted cooler now, cleaner, and took it as a sign. And now here, as you sit with me in the hush of this moment, consider this. What does it mean to owe your child's life to someone you don't understand? Someone your people have eyed with suspicion, someone whose name is said more often in whispers than handshakes? What happens next when the fever breaks, and the child laughs again, and the debt of healing still hangs in the air, like a storm that hasn't quite rolled through? This isn't just a story of rescue, it's the story of what comes after, of gratitude that becomes complicated, of tradition stepping into the path of thanks, of a town with old customs, and a family with new questions, and a man whose hands, though brown and weathered, held more gentleness than anyone expected. So hold this beginning close, because the path forward will not be simple. He saved her life. Yes, but not without cost, not without consequence, and in the next light of dawn, the whispers will begin, and everything will start to change. When the first crack of light peeled over the hills, soft and golden like a quiet apology after a long night of weeping, the world seemed to hold its breath again, not in terror this time, but in stillness, in the long exhale after something sacred had brushed the edge of the living. Inside the ranch house, the air was thick with wood smoke and whispers. The walls lined with shadows stretched long by oil lamps that had burned through the dark, and there on the narrow bed beneath a cross-stitched quilt, faded with years of sun and sorrow, the little girl lay sleeping, not dead, not gone, but held gently in the arms of healing and chance, her breathing shallow but steady, her forehead damp with the slow labor of surviving. The Cherokee doctor sat beside her, chin resting on one calloused hand, eyes red-rimmed from the night he refused to close them, his body heavy but unwilling to yield, as if sleep were a luxury he hadn't earned yet, not until he knew she'd made it past the fever's fiercest wave. And her father stood in the doorway, arms crossed but not in defiance and dread, in weariness, in a deep tangle of love and guilt that no man as proud as him ever expected to feel. Because when the rattlesnake struck, when the scream tore through the ranch like a gunshot on a silent Sunday, he hadn't been close enough, hadn't been watching, and that failure, that instant of absence, would haunt him in ways the doctor might never understand. But the truth is, healing doesn't stop with the wound. It lingers in the silence afterward, in the way two men who barely knew each other now shared a bond stronger than any handshake, sealed not with words but with blood, breath, and the trembling pulse of a child who almost slipped away. And as the sun filtered through lace curtains and turned the dust in the air to flecks of gold, The ranch owner spoke for the first time in hours, just one word. Coffee? A simple offering, not of thanks, not yet, but of peace, a beginning. And the doctor nodded, rising slowly, his joints aching like old fence posts in morning frost, and followed the man into the kitchen where the stove hissed and the kettle rattled like a distant train. They sat in silence at first, two men stitched from different cloths, one born of cattle and rifles, the other of rivers and elder songs. But here, now, in the hum of early morning, they were just fathers in fear, protectors who had nearly failed. And in that shared vulnerability, something unspoken passed between them, something that might grow or unravel, depending on what came next. And you, listener, viewer, wanderer of stories, do you feel it? That thick silence wrapped around them like the smell of hot iron and pine ash? This is not a tale of easy friendship or sudden trust. No, it is the slow burn of understanding. The hesitant steps towards seeing the man behind the history behind the man. And when the doctor finally broke the silence with a soft murmur, "She be weak, but I think she lived," the rancher closed his eyes for just a moment too long, as if those words had pierced something deeper than skin, something he hadn't dared hope for. And when he opened them again, his voice was rough as gravel but steady. "Then I owe you something I can never repay." And the doctor, with a half smile and a shake of his head, said, "You don't owe me anything but to let her be a child." Again, not a debt to carry, but debts, as you'll soon see, don't always obey the men who try to dismiss them. And this one, this act of healing, would stir things older than either man could control. Later, when the girl woke, eyes blinking in the amber light of morning, her lips dry and cracked, her voice barely a breath, the first thing she did was reach not for her father, but for the man who'd sat beside her through the darkness. And her small fingers closed around his in trust, in memory, in wordless gratitude that made the rancher's heart both swell and break at once. He watched them, that child and the man who'd saved her, and felt something foreign rise in him, a mixture of fear, of pride, of protectiveness sharpened by uncertainty. And when he looked away, he saw through the window the shape of a neighbor's wagon trundling up the road, dust trailing behind like a warning. Word had already spread, as it always did in towns where news traveled faster than the wind, and before long the porch would be crowded with voices, curious, cautious, maybe cruel, and the delicate stillness of the morning would fracture under the weight of too many opinions, too much tradition, too many expectations built on the bones of what should be, not what is. But for now, for this breath, the house was still, the doctor's hand still held, the girl alive, and the world a little softer for it. Outside, the cattle stirred, lowed, moved on instinct alone, and the wind carried the smell of the creek and the faintest notes of mesquite and tobacco from the doctor's pouch, a scent the girl would later say reminded her of feeling safe. And now, as the day stretches wide and the town wakes to news it didn't expect, of a Cherokee healer and a white rancher's child bound by a night of pain and salvation, remember this: the land itself does not take sides. It only remembers what is planted in it: mercy, cruelty, sacrifice, love, and soon, what was planted this night will bloom, not just in the heart of one girl or one man, but across fences, through front doors, into the courtroom of public opinion where the old ways wait like judges draped in dust, and they will demand more than thanks, more than quiet nods. They will demand ritual, restoration, binding, because in this place, in this wild stretch of country where legend is stitched from truth, gratitude can take on a weight heavier than vengeance, and healing can cost more than anyone expected. The morning after the fever broke, as the sun stretched its amber limbs across the hills and painted the ranch in warm, forgiving light, the Cherokee doctor found himself walking the edge of the pasture, away from the house, away from the eyes that had begun to peer too long through dusty windows, needing a space to breathe, to remember who he was before this child's life tethered him to a world not built for him. And the wind that carried the scent of dry hay and dew-wet cattle also carried with it echoes of the old voices. His grandmother's hands folding tobacco leaves with reverence. His uncle's whispers about the plants that spoke only if you listened with your skin, not your ears, and most of all, the soft hum of a lullaby sung in a language not broken by translation. A lullaby he had hummed without thinking as he'd cleaned the girl's wound, as if somewhere in her, the land still remembered the language. 2. He bent at the fence line, fingers brushing against yarrow blooming defiantly between rocks, and he thought of the first time he'd been taught what healing meant, not in the white man's books, but in the quiet watching of a deer pause beside a bleeding birch, or the way his mother had said, "Don't just cure comfort." And now here, in this town that watched him with suspicion and reluctant awe, he understood what his elders had meant by burden. It wasn't just saving a life. It was carrying what came after, the glances, the debts, the danger of being needed by those who didn't want to need you. Back at the house, the girl had risen with help, whispering thank you with a fragile smile that undid something in his chest, and the rancher had stood close behind, his eyes still unreadable but no longer cold, and for the briefest moment, the three of them had occupied a strange kind of peace, like animals drinking at the same riverbank out of necessity, not kinship, and he knew it wouldn't last. Towns like these didn't bend easily, and mercy, when it came from a man like him, stirred old ghosts' memories of land taken, lies told, treaties broken, and they didn't like to be reminded that the same hands they feared could also offer salvation. The first knock on the door came before noon. A neighbor, polite but tight-lipped, hat in hand, asking how the girl was, but his eyes said more, said everything. Who's watching? Who's listening? What's being said? And behind him, more shapes gathered until by evening, a slow parade of townsfolk had made their way to the porch with casseroles, questions, sideways glances, and every single one of them left with a story in their mouth and a weight in their chest. Because it's hard to hate a man whose hands held your neighbor's daughter while she shook with death, and harder still to speak ill of someone your children now call the one who saved her. But beneath the surface, deeper currents stirred at the general store. Whispers began, about tradition, about debts unpaid, about old pacts some remembered only vaguely, the kind that said when a healer saves a child, bonds must be honored. Not with coin, but with commitment, and though no one dared say it outright yet, the idea was rising like steam from sunburnt soil, slow and inevitable. The doctor heard it too, not in words, but in the changed air, in the way even the friendly greetings were laced with something heavier, something expectant, and when he walked past the saloon that evening, boots clicking against wood, he felt eyes on him, some grateful, some wary, some calculating. He returned to the ranch not long after, where the girl had begun to eat again, small spoonfuls of broth, and her voice had regained its melody, though soft, like the breeze through early corn stalks, and when she asked him to tell her another story, one of animals and stars, he did, without hesitation, because in her presence, all the noise quieted, and he could just be the man his ancestors would be proud of. But her father was different now, restless, pacing more often, as if the weight of what had been done, the saving, the living, the being in debt, had begun to sink like stones in his stomach. And one evening, as the sun bled red over the hills, and the cattle murmured their way to the barn, he said it, almost under his breath, but loud enough to shatter everything. "They're saying there's a ritual." And the doctor, who had known this moment would come, looked up slowly, the story unfinished in his mouth, and said nothing at first, because what is there to say when the truth has finally arrived? The rancher went on, hesitant, like each word cost him something precious. Back when folks still kept to the old ties, they'd say a life saved like that, especially a child, meant a bond had to be honored with marriage, and there it was, the cost that had always been hiding beneath the gratitude, the price of mercy whispered through generations, until it became more law than lore. The doctor stood, silent still, his heart not surprised but tired, so tired, because he had never healed for reward, never saved to be owed, and now here was this, not from the father's mouth alone, but from the town itself, pressing in like a tide of expectation. And as the girl slept that night, the moonlight returning once more through the curtains, he sat alone on the porch, eyes cast out toward the dark line of trees, remembering every teaching of restraint, of letting others speak first, of never demanding what was not freely given. But this was different. This was not love, not partnership. This was obligation painted with tradition. And it made his chest ache with something close to sorrow, because he knew if he refused, it would not be just him who bore the brunt, the girl, the father, even the fragile bridge of goodwill that had been built over her fevered body, would all feel the tremble of his no. And now, dear listener, you may be asking, how can a man carry the weight of such honor, such history, and still say no to the thing the town sees as sacred? Or worse, how could he ever say yes? In the coming days, that question will rise from every table, every porch step, every church pew, and it will press him, bend him, test the root of his mercy, the strength of his silence, and whether or not healing, when freely given, must always come with chains. In the days that followed the whispered revival of the ritual talk, the ranch seemed to settle into a rhythm. Not quite natural, like a horse forced into a gait it didn't trust. And though the girl's cheeks slowly colored with health and her laughter sometimes broke through the still air like birdsong after drought, the house itself held a tension you could smell in the walls, like rain that hadn't yet fallen or a fire that hadn't quite burned out. And the doctor, still staying on the ranch out of necessity and watchfulness, found himself caught between two silences, the child's gentle trust, which wrapped around him like an old, familiar blanket, and the father's wary quiet, which bristled like barbed wire just beneath the surface. It was in the way the rancher nodded too quickly when they passed each other in the hallway, or the way he lingered near the porch when the doctor was out in the yard gathering wild mint for tea, watching but saying nothing, as though trying to solve a riddle he never asked to be given. And the doctor felt it all, absorbed it like clay absorbs heat, this strange, unspoken balance between reverence and suspicion, between the debt of a father and the autonomy of a healer who had never asked to be anyone's savior and yet had become exactly that. The girl, unaware of the weight swirling around her recovery, simply wanted him near. She asked for his stories, his quiet songs, the way he tied knots in leather strips with a kind of poetic care, and she'd begun calling him Doc Chi, the name shortened and sweetened by her lisping recovery, and the sound of it made something warm and dangerous stir in his chest, because it felt too close to family, too close to love, and love in this place was no soft thing. It was a barbed promise that could be twisted into obligation before you could say no. And yet, how do you say no to a child who places flowers at your bedside each morning? How do you pull away from the small voice that asks if you'll stay long enough to see her ride again, or help her carve her initials into the oak tree behind the barn, beside her mother's, now faded into the bark like a ghost you dare not disturb? Her mother, another silence in the house, one the rancher never spoke of, but whose absence hung in the girl's eyes like a permanent cloud. And maybe that's why her father looked at the doctor with such quiet confusion, because the only man his daughter had clung to since her mother's death was now this quiet, brown-skinned healer who knew more about her heartbeat than he did. And for a man raised on bloodlines and borders, that stirred a storm he didn't know how to tame. And so the days unfolded soft and strange, with the doctor splitting firewood 1 hour, then reading aloud from a tattered field guide to prairie plants the next, all while the town outside the ranch fence hummed louder with speculation, the saloon's whispers curdling into murmurs of honor and heritage, and what would or should be done to seal the healing that had already taken place. And it was always said just quietly enough to be denied, but loud enough to be heard. And the doctor, who heard it all through the wind and sideways glances when he rode into town for supplies, knew that they were preparing something, some kind of reckoning or demand masked as tradition, and yet he said nothing, not because he didn't care, but because he was still weighing the girl's laugh against the coming weight of expectation, still balancing the father's guarded gratitude against the legacy of rituals twisted over time to serve pride rather than purpose. He remembered stories his grandmother told about how healing once meant freedom, how medicine men and women were honored not by binding them to families, but by releasing them from all demands, their only duty to the people, not to one person. And yet in this town, in this century, that purity had eroded. And now healing was seen as a favor, a transaction, a pact inked in obligation. And each evening, as the sun bled behind the hills and the cattle settled into their low grunts and huffs, the doctor sat alone beneath the oak tree while the girl slept, the same tree with her mother's initials worn smooth into the bark, and wondered how a moment of mercy had led to this, how the simple act of keeping a child alive had brought him to the edge of being claimed like a relic. And worse, how much worse it would be for the girl if he refused and the town turned on him, turned on her, whispered things in her ear about dishonor and broken promises that she was too young to understand. And the father, too, seemed to struggle, torn between something old and something true, because he'd seen with his own eyes the way the doctor knelt by her bed, had heard the way his daughter whispered in her sleep for him, not for her father. And that made him ache with jealousy he didn't want to admit, jealousy sharpened by guilt, because the man he envied was the same man who had given him back his daughter's breath. One night, just before the storm finally came, the father sat on the porch beside the doctor, both men watching the lightning crawl across the distant sky. And after a long silence, he said, without looking at him, "You didn't have to stay." "But you did." And the doctor replied, just as soft, "She needed me to." And they left it there, hanging between them like a fence neither was sure how to cross. And in that moment, the girl's laughter from earlier in the day seemed to echo in both their chests, a fragile bridge between two men built not on trust, but on a shared devotion to the same small heart. And that perhaps was the most dangerous thing of all, because love, when shared unevenly, becomes a lever, and the town had already begun to place its weight on one side. And soon, the balance would break. The storm arrived not with thunder, but with footsteps measured, deliberate, and too many to ignore. And it was just past noon when the first wagon creaked to a stop at the ranch gate, its wooden wheels groaning against the dry earth like some old judge clearing his throat before a sentence. And behind it came another, then another, until the line of wagons and horses stretched like a funeral procession across the horizon. And it was in that moment, before a single word was spoken, that the Cherokee doctor knew the town had made its decision. He stood on the porch beside the rancher, neither man speaking, the air between them thick with the smoke of breakfast fires long gone cold. And though the sun baked down with an almost theatrical brightness, the weight in the sky said otherwise. And when the town councilman stepped forward, a man named Trenton Rowe, silver-haired and sun-cracked, the kind of voice that always sounded like it was speaking for more than one person, he tipped his hat out of formality, not respect, and said, "We've come to see the healer." And that word healer carried with it the echo of a title too sacred to be used so casually, but too convenient now for them to deny. And the doctor stepped down from the porch, dust rising around his boots like a signal, and faced them not with defiance, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had known for days this was coming, someone who had heard the whispers behind the walls of the general store, who had seen the way eyes lingered longer than necessary, who had watched the way the rancher's shoulders slumped further with each evening he failed to say what needed to be said. The councilman wasted no time. "The girl lives because of you. That much no one disputes. And because of that, the town owes you an answer and an offer, both carried on the weight of old ways that don't forget favors as sacred as life itself." And with that, he stepped aside, revealing from behind him a woman draped in shawls of crimson and sage, a relic from an era long buried, her face lined like riverbeds in drought, her eyes sharp with memory. And she held in her hands a bundle of cedar and dried sweetgrass, the kind of offering not made lightly, and it was then that the wind stilled and the crowd seemed to breathe as one. The doctor recognized her, Miss Alda, the oldest living voice of the mixed heritage community nearby, half Cherokee, half settler, whose word was respected even by those who claimed they no longer followed those kinds of traditions, and she stepped forward with slow reverence, placed the bundle at the doctor's feet, and said, "You saved the child not as a man of medicine, but as one of spirit, of lineage, of calling. In the old way, that means you are bound now, not just to her life, but to her blood, her name, her future." And her voice was not cruel, not forceful, but steady, ceremonial, like a bell rung not to warn, but to summon. And with those words, the town murmured, some in approval, some in discomfort, but none in surprise, and the doctor felt the gaze of the crowd not as warmth, but as a net, each eye a knot tying him tighter to the center of a story he had never asked to be part of. The rancher stepped forward now, eyes unreadable, voice low. "They're saying to honor what you did, to seal it proper, you'd marry her." And though his voice did not tremble, something in it cracked, because even now he didn't know if he wanted this as a father or feared it as a man. And the doctor looked at him, then past him, to the girl standing barefoot in the doorway, still too young to understand the weight of the word marriage, but old enough to know something serious was happening, and she tilted her head, watching him with those soft, trusting eyes that had haunted his sleep for days. And the wind returned then, gently, like a breath held too long finally released, rustling the sweetgrass at his feet as if urging him to choose. The silence stretched long enough for the murmurs to grow impatient, for the first stones of judgment to be lifted in men's hearts, and then the doctor, voice calm but iron underneath, said, "I did what I did because she needed saving. That's all. I gave her back to her father. That should be enough." And Miss Alda stepped closer, no anger in her eyes, only sadness, and said, "Sometimes the old ways ask more, because they remember deeper than we do." And the councilman added, "You wouldn't be forced, only honored. But if you refuse, they'll say you dishonored the bond. You know how talk works around here. And that, more than anything, was the twist of the knife, the understanding that this wasn't about law or love or even legacy. It was about perception, about the town needing a clean story, a noble ending, something to point to and say, "See? We respect his people. We let him in. We honored his gift when really all they wanted was closure. A tidy knot to tie off the guilt of needing a man they'd spent years keeping at arm's length." And the doctor, who had once healed with roots and silence, felt a deeper wound opening not in his body, but in the space between him and this girl, this family, this place that would never see him as just a man, but always as symbol, as bridge, as burden. And he turned slowly, locking eyes with the rancher, who said nothing, then with the girl, who took a hesitant step forward, unsure, hopeful, and her innocence struck him like a blow, because she did not understand this was not a proposal but a pact, not a love but a duty forged in fire. And he knelt before her, took her hands and said, "You owe me nothing. You're not mine. You're your own." And the girl, young but wise in that strange way children can be, whispered, "But you stayed." And he nodded, tears stinging the corners of his eyes as he said, "Because you needed me to, not because they told me to." And behind them, the town watched, unsure how to react, unsure how to turn this refusal into something honorable. And the doctor stood, turned back to Miss Alda, and said, "If your old ways ask for a sacrifice, let it be mine. Let the story be that I gave without asking, and you received without chaining." And for a long moment, nothing moved. Then Miss Alda bent, lifted the sweetgrass and walked away, and one by one, the townsfolk followed. No cheers, no anger. Only silence, the kind that follows a sermon too honest to clap for. And as the last wagon rolled away, the doctor remained standing in the dust, hands empty but soul intact, and beside him, the rancher finally exhaled, then placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "You did the right thing." And for the first time in days, They both believed it. The days after the ritual refusal settled like dust after a stampede, thick, slow, and impossible not to breathe in, and though the wagons had disappeared and no torches were raised, something in the air had changed, not sharp and violent, but cold and brittle, like a window left open in the dead of winter, and the doctor felt it first in the silence, in the absence of footsteps on the porch, in the way the town no longer sent visitors with pies or polite questions, just space, vast and deliberate. And the girl felt it too, though she couldn't name it, couldn't explain why her friends no longer rode out to the ranch to play, why the woman from the church, who used to bring her coloring books, now crossed the street when they passed in town. And it wasn't because anyone had said something cruel, it was because everyone had decided something quiet, that what could have been a clean ending was now a story left too open, too complicated, too much of a mirror they didn't want to look into, and so they turned away, and the girl, once so full of chatter and light, grew quieter, more inward, watching her father and the doctor with wide eyes that asked questions neither man knew how to answer. The rancher tried, he really did. He told her stories at night, fixed the broken fence she kept pointing at, even baked biscuits one morning, though they turned out like bricks, and the doctor, still living in the guest room because the girl refused to sleep witut knowing he was near, continued to care for her with the same quiet devotion. But now there was a tension between him and the rancher that neither could name, only feel, like a knot pulled tighter with every passing day. It came out in the small things, the way the doctor no longer joined him for coffee on the porch, the way the rancher stopped leaving the gate unlocked when he rode into town, the way their conversations dropped into silence halfway through, as if both men were trying to avoid the same truth. They were both tethered to the same girl, but not in the same way, and that difference, once invisible, now throbbed between them like a wound that wouldn't close. And the town, for its part, kept its distance, but not its eyes. Every trip into town for supplies was met with glances that slid off skin like sleet. Not hateful, just cold, just watching, waiting. And when the doctor walked into the general store one morning and found the usual herbs he used for poultices had been moved to the very back, behind bags of flour no one ever touched, he said nothing, just nodded to the clerk who didn't nod back, and walked out into the sun feeling not surprised but tired, so deeply tired. Back at the ranch, the girl had started asking questions. Why no one came to visit? Why the kids at church didn't talk to her? Why Miss Alda hadn't come back with another story? And each question dug deeper into the men who loved her, because neither could explain how adults break promises without ever saying a word, how a town could claim to honor someone and then slowly erase them, how mercy could be turned into a myth too inconvenient to remember. And one night, when the wind was howling through the trees and the fire had burned down low, the girl whispered to the doctor, "Did I do something wrong?" And it cracked him open, not with anger but with grief, because how do you explain to a child that her healing had cost more than it should have, that the debt had never been hers, but was now carved into her world like initials on the old oak tree? And so he took her hand and said, "No, little one, you did everything right. They just don't know how to be grateful without making it hurt." And she looked up at him, confused but trusting, and nodded as if that was enough for now. But the hurt deepened when, a week later, someone scrawled words on the side of the barn. Not cruel, exactly, not a slur, just a phrase old and heavy. Custom should be kept. And the rancher found it first, early morning, before the girl woke, and stood staring at it for a long time, jaw tight, fists clenched, because it was written in paint he recognized from his own supply shed. And though he'd always thought his neighbors were decent, maybe that was the problem. Decent men could still hold hate like a horseshoe held heat, and he washed it off before the girl could see. But the doctor saw him doing it and didn't offer to help, just stood at the barn door, watching, something like resignation in his eyes. And that night, they argued, not loudly, not with fists or shouting, but with the sharpness that comes when two men believe they're both protecting the same thing in different ways. And the doctor said, "You should have spoken for me at the gathering," and the ranchers snapped back, "It wouldn't have mattered." And both knew they were right, and both knew they were wrong, and the silence after that was worse than the words. The girl, caught in the middle of this quiet war, began spending more time by the creek, skipping stones and drawing in the dirt. And one afternoon she came home with a wounded bird in her hands, cradling it like a sacred thing, whispering for it not to die, and the doctor knelt with her, showed her how to bind its wing, how to feed it gently, and for 3 days they watched it recover, watched it hop and chirp and eventually fly again, and when it did, she looked at him and said, "See? Sometimes things get better," and he nodded, not trusting himself to speak, because she was right, but also so wrong, because not everything with wings finds wind again, and not every kindness gets to live without consequence. The rancher, seeing how close they remained, began to pull back, not out of jealousy, but out of fear. Fear that the girl was building her roots in someone who might one day be driven out, someone whose place here was always temporary, no matter how many lives he saved. And that fear twisted him, made him shorter with his words, longer with his absences. And one night, when the girl asked if Doc Chi would stay forever, the doctor answered, "As long as you need me." And that answer, so gentle, so conditional, haunted her father more than any vow could have, because he realized in that moment what he had done, not just to the doctor, but to his daughter. By refusing the town's offer, by refusing to fight for a different ending. And now, the fury wasn't at the town or the doctor, but at himself, because he had built his life on protecting what was his, and now he had a home full of love, and no way to keep it safe. And so, the bonds that once seemed to hold them together began to fray, not all at once, not with drama, but with the slow erosion of shared meals turned to solo plates, of laughter fading quicker than it used to, of silence stretching too long between good nights. And though no one said it, everyone felt it, that the miracle that saved the girl's life had left a scar too big to ignore. And if something didn't change soon, the healing that had once bound them would be the very thing that tore them apart. Beneath the weight of days that blurred into each other like brushstrokes too heavy with the same color, the Cherokee doctor began to feel something he hadn't known in years, a kind of quiet unraveling, not loud or obvious, but steady, like the soft fray of thread on the edge of a well-worn coat. And it started with the mornings, where once he had risen early to boil herbs and hum prayers into the tea he made for the girl. Now he sat longer at the edge of the bed, staring at his hands, at the calluses mapped across his palms, like some language he no longer knew how to read, wondering how they had come to be both worshipped and unwanted in the same place, how the very hands that had drawn poison from the veins of a dying child could now stir discomfort in her neighbors, how the world could watch him kneel in mercy and rise in suspicion. And the questions began to follow him through the pasture, through the town, through his memories, winding around him like smoke he couldn't breathe clear of, and most of all, one question refused to let him go. Who am I when the healing is no longer needed? Because that's what it felt like now that the town had taken his gift like a borrowed tool, used it until the danger passed, and now wanted to return it clean and cold, without looking him in the eye. And even on the ranch where the girl still laughed when he whittled shapes from driftwood, and the ranchers still nodded when their paths crossed at dusk, it was clear something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like the taste of iron in well water, and it made the doctor begin to doubt not the goodness of what he had done, but the purpose of remaining where his presence seemed to cast a shadow longer than his silhouette. And as he walked the land each morning, boots stirring red dust into the cool air, he remembered the teachings of his people, the stories about soil that remembers footsteps, about healing that must be earned, not just given, and about the danger of staying too long where you are only half wanted. And he began to question not just the town, but himself, his place in this fractured inheritance he carried, this dual identity that walked with him like a second spine. One foot in the world of scalpels and antiseptics, the other in the whisper of river reeds and sweat lodges. And though he had learned to walk both paths, he had never before felt them pulling in opposite directions as they were now. One night, unable to sleep, he pulled from his pack an old bundle wrapped in deerskin notes and drawings, seeds his grandmother once tucked into his coat before he left their land. A braid of her hair now dry and silver as frost, and he sat with them under the cottonwood tree, listening to the wind through the branches, hoping for clarity, but finding only more questions. And it was then the rancher came to him, quiet, holding 2 mugs of coffee that steamed like the earth after rain, and said, not looking at him, "I've been thinking a lot." And the doctor replied, "So have I," and they sat in silence for a while, letting the wind speak for them, until the rancher said, "I don't know how to fix what I broke." And the doctor, with a tired kind of kindness, answered, "It wasn't just you." And they left it at that, because sometimes apology is not a bandage but a seed, and it takes time to sprout. And as the days turned and the girl grew stronger, riding again in short loops around the barn, drawing pictures of birds and men with hats who looked suspiciously like him, the doctor began to see that while the town may have closed its doors, the girl had not. She still opened hers every day, wide and bright, asking questions about stars and bones and whether birds dream. And in those moments he remembered why he stayed, not for legacy or ritual, but for the gentle, stubborn pull of her laughter, for the way she said, "Thank you," without needing to, for the way she trusted his silence as much as his words. But even that light was shadowed when he rode into town for supplies and found a note tacked to the store door. "We heal our own." And though it wasn't signed, the handwriting was familiar, tight, sharp, proud, and it didn't make him angry. It made him tired, because he had hoped that what he did for the girl might change something, shift some ancient stone in the town's foundation. But instead, it seemed only to deepen the cracks, to make people dig in their heels harder into soil that had never truly been theirs to begin with. And that night, back on the ranch, he asked himself aloud the question he had feared for weeks. What happens to a healer in a place that doesn't want healing? And the wind, as always, offered no answer. Only the rustle of dry leaves and the distant creak of the barn gate swinging slow and steady like a pendulum. And the girl, overhearing from the window, wrote the question down in her notebook, thinking it sounded like a riddle, and promised herself she'd find the answer for him one day. Because even if the town didn't see him anymore, she still saw the way he knelt by hurt animals, saw the way he still boiled tea each morning just in case she needed it, saw the way he looked at the land like it was speaking a language he understood and missed all at once. And to her, that made him the most important kind of person, the kind who stayed even when he wasn't asked to, the kind who listened even when no one was talking, the kind who carried questions like other people carried names. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new, something not born of obligation or tradition or even gratitude, but of choice, a soil turned over, ready for a different kind of seed. The dawn that broke over the ranch on the wedding day everything changed was not spectacular, not the kind that painted the sky in ribbons of fire or sent birds into a frenzy. It was soft, almost hesitant, the sky pale and cloud-streaked, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. And the light that spilled across the fields was quiet and golden, the kind that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives. And perhaps that was fitting, because this was not a day born of spectacle, but of truth, the kind of truth that takes its time getting to the surface, pushing through the soil like roots that have been growing in secret. The Cherokee doctor rose before the sun, unable to sleep, the weight of too many days, too many silences heavy in his chest. And as he stepped out onto the porch, the wood cool under his bare feet, he felt the stillness around him not as peace, but as pause, as the moment before a choice is made, before a word is spoken that can't be taken back. And in that breath of quiet, he made his decision. Inside, the girl still slept, curled beneath her quilt with one hand resting near her heart, as if holding something precious even in her dreams. And the rancher sat at the table with his coffee untouched, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood as though it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. And when the doctor stepped inside, their eyes met, and there was no need for preamble. No polite talk about weather or chores, just a long look between two men who knew the time had come to stop walking in circles around what was breaking them. "I'm going to the chapel," the doctor said, voice low but steady. And the rancher nodded once, slowly, then stood, took his hat from the hook, and followed him without a word, because whatever was coming, it needed to be faced together. The chapel stood at the edge of town, half cedar and half memory, built generations ago by hands that never agreed on much except that the land was sacred and the sky watched everything. And as they approached, they saw the crowd already gathering, some leaning on wagons, others on canes, their faces a mosaic of curiosity, weariness, pride, fear, and something else too, guilt maybe, or the hope of being proven wrong. And among them stood Miss Alda, her shawl heavy around her shoulders, her eyes sharp and unreadable. And when the doctor and the rancher stepped onto the worn planks of the chapel porch, all conversation stopped. The doctor didn't raise his voice when he began to speak. He didn't need to, because every word carried the weight of weeks, of silence held too long, of wounds left unspoken. "I came when I was called," he began, eyes moving across the crowd, not with accusation, but with the calm of someone who had nothing left to hide. "I came because a child was dying, and I didn't ask what she believed or what blood ran in her veins. I didn't ask if I'd be welcomed. I came because healing is not a gift I keep, it's one I give." And the murmurs started, low and shifting like wind through corn. But no one interrupted, and he continued, "And when she lived, some of you said thank you with your eyes, your hands, your silence. But then the story changed. Then you decided the only way to honor what happened was to bind me to it, to her, to a life I didn't choose. You called it tradition, you called it respect, but I call it something else. I call it a prison built from gratitude that's afraid to say thank you and let that be enough." And now the murmurs were louder, some faces hardening, others softening, and still no one moved, and he pressed on, voice rising not in anger, but in clarity. "I won't be a symbol. I won't be your excuse for saying you're better than you were yesterday. You want to honor me? Let the girl be free. Let her father love her without debt hanging between them. Let me walk through your town without your shame weighing down every step." And at that, a man near the back, tall, with arms crossed and jaw set, said, "You think you're better than us?" And the doctor turned, looked him full in the eye, and said, "No, I think I'm just finally tired of pretending. I'm lucky to be tolerated." And the words hung there, like a struck bell, ringing through the morning air, and for a moment, no one breathed. Then, to everyone's surprise, it was the rancher who stepped forward, removing his hat, holding it tight in both hands like a man about to confess to something sacred. And he said, voice rough as gravel but steady, "He saved my daughter's life. That's not a debt. That's a blessing. And I let it turn into a burden because I didn't know how to say thank you without trying to make it permanent. I thought maybe if I let the town do what it always does, it would make everything easier. But it didn't. It made it worse. And I'm sorry for what I did and for what I didn't do." And he turned, looked at the doctor, and added, "I can't change what they think, but I can change where I stand." And with that, he stepped down off the porch and stood beside the doctor, shoulder to shoulder, and in that simple motion, something shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but enough. Miss Alda stepped forward. Then, and her voice, though soft, carried like song. The old ways were never meant to be chains. They were meant to be bridges. And if a bridge becomes a trap, then it is no longer sacred. It is simply old. And her words, like wind, moved through the crowd, stirring memories and doubts. And slowly, the crowd began to change, not all at once, not all together, but one by one. People began to nod, to murmur agreement, to lower the guard that had risen in fear, and though no one cheered, no one shouted, there was a kind of stillness that followed, a stillness that felt like soil turning, ready to receive something new. And in that silence, the doctor stepped down from the porch, felt the warmth of the rancher beside him, the presence of Miss Alda behind him, and somewhere in the distance, he imagined the girl at the ranch waking to the sound of birds, unaware that her world had just shifted, that the soil beneath her home had just opened to something new, something unspoken but deeply felt. And as the doctor walked back through the parting crowd, his steps no longer drew stares, no longer felt like trespass. He was not forgiven, not celebrated, but he was seen, and that in a place like this was a beginning. The morning after, the stand at the chapel passed without incident. No sermons, no protests, no applause. Just a stillness in the air, like the breath of the land itself had changed gentler, easier, as if something heavy had been set down by everyone at once. And back at the ranch, the girl woke with sunlight in her hair and a smile that came easier than it had in weeks. Her body stronger, her steps quicker, and when she saw the doctor tending to the herb garden by the fence, she ran to him barefoot, laughing, calling his name not with desperation, but joy, and he caught her mid-stride, lifting her like a breeze lifts a bird, and for a moment, neither of them said a word, because they didn't need to. The weight was gone, the unspoken fear that had been wrapped around every smile, every question, every story was finally loosening its grip, and though the past hadn't disappeared, it no longer chased them like a shadow at noon. Inside the house, the rancher watched through the kitchen window, mug in hand, face unreadable for a beat before a slow, tired smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, not because things were perfect, but because they were finally real raw, imperfect, and free of the rituals that had nearly turned a blessing into a burden. And when he stepped outside to join them, the three of them stood there under the big sky like something out of an old story. Three people held together, not by obligation, but by the kind of bond that has survived fire and silence and come through changed. That day, they didn't talk about what had happened at the chapel, not directly, but it was in the way the rancher brought out a second stool for the doctor, in the way the girl braided grass into a crown and placed it on his head like a queen, dubbing her knight, and in the way the doctor, who had once kept his distance even in his kindness, now leaned into the warmth, let himself be pulled into the gravity of a home that had stopped being temporary. And yet, healing isn't a single act, it's a river, moving slow and steady, cutting through rock not by force but persistence, and that river had to keep flowing. The town, for its part, didn't transform overnight. There were still stares, still whispers, but they had softened, no longer laced with threat or expectation, just curiosity, the kind that comes when people begin to wonder if they'd been wrong about something all along. And some even came forward, cautiously, like deer approaching a still pond. Mrs. Callahan brought over a pie, eyes downcast but her thank you audible this time. And young Eli, the blacksmith's boy, rode out to ask the doctor how to set a splint for a hurt rabbit. And while these weren't declarations of change, they were something better, beginnings, gentle ripples in the water. One evening, under a sky smeared with lavender and coal, the rancher found the doctor sketching something in the dirt. Behind the barn, a circle with lines branching from it like veins or roots, and when he asked what it was, the doctor said, "A medicine wheel, not for magic, for remembering." And the rancher nodded, sat beside him, and said, "Mind if I help?" And together, in the dust of a land that had once tried to divide them, they drew lines that connected instead, and when the girl saw it later, she said it looked like a sun that had found its middle again, and maybe it was. In the days that followed, the rhythm of life resumed: chores, meals, rides into town, but now each action felt touched by something deeper, like the air itself held memory, like the house had finally exhaled. The doctor began planting new herbs near the back fence, ones he hadn't dared to before. And the rancher cleared out the old tool shed, offering it as a workspace. And though neither man said it aloud, they knew this meant something more than politeness. It meant permanence. Or at least the invitation of it. And the girl, growing more sure-footed by the day, started asking about the doctor's home, his people, his stories before her. And he told her, not all at once, not like a lecture, but in slow moments, in the spaces between milking the goat and stitching a tear in her dress. And she listened with wide eyes, asking questions no one in the town had ever thought to ask. Like, what did cedar mean in a prayer? And why did some plants only bloom at night? And did he miss where he came? From end to each question, he gave her not just answers, but pieces of himself, not out of duty but trust. And then came the rain, hard and sudden, the kind that soaks you through in seconds. And when it hit the ranch, they ran for cover laughing, soaked to the skin, the girl spinning in the downpour like it was a gift. And when they made it to the porch, breathless and dripping, the doctor looked out at the land, the fields, the creek now swollen with life, and felt something inside him shift, something he hadn't allowed in years. Peace, not the peace of being alone or distant, but of being known, of being wanted not for his use but for his being. And as he leaned back against the porch post, the girl curled at his feet and the rancher humming tunelessly over the kettle, he closed his eyes and thought of rivers, not the ones he'd crossed, but the one he'd found here, winding through this land, this family, not perfect but true. And he knew then that redemption wasn't a single act or a moment of public forgiveness. It was a life built slowly after everything breaks. It was mornings that didn't hurt to wake up to. It was laughter not followed by fear. It was planting seeds even when you're not sure they'll grow. And in that moment, with the rain still pattering against the roof and the smell of sage rising from the doorway, he understood something his grandmother once told him, something he hadn't believed until now. The river remembers not the storm, but the stone that stayed. And here, on this land that once threatened to reject him, he had become the stone, not unmoving, but steady, not invincible, but rooted. And around him, the water kept flowing, not washing him away, but shaping him into something that belonged. In the weeks that followed the rain, the ranch took on a rhythm so natural it felt as though it had always been that way, as though the fractures and tensions of the past months had been laid gently into the soil and turned under like compost. No longer something to trip over, but something that now fed the roots of what was growing. And what was growing was not just plants or cattle, but something quieter, more sacred legacy. Not the kind that hangs framed on a wall or carved into a gravestone, but the living kind, passed from hand to hand, gaze to gaze, word to word. And it began with the little things, like the girl waking early to check the new herbs planted behind the fence line, her fingers brushing the leaves with the same tenderness the doctor had shown her, murmuring the names he'd taught her in both English and Cherokee yarrow. Dewy as sage, Gadusti, and her voice, soft and halting, carried across the morning air like a prayer, learning how to be born. And the doctor, who now slept not in the guest room, but in a small outbuilding he had converted into his own, watched her from the doorway with the kind of pride that doesn't need to be spoken, the kind that lodges quietly in the chest like a warm coal, steady and sustaining. The rancher, too, had changed, not in the loud ways townspeople expect when they look for redemption, but in the quiet spaces of routine. He began asking questions, not just about medicine but about meaning, about the plants growing wild at the edge of the field, about the songs the girl hummed under her breath that weren't his, about the carvings the doctor sometimes left in the posts of the barn, subtle, simple, full of stories he didn't yet understand but was learning to ask about. And though he was not a man given to confession, he had begun, once or twice a week, to sit across from the doctor as the sun dipped low, sharing stories of his own past, the death of his wife, the ache of trying to be father and mother at once, the guilt of believing he'd failed her in that one moment when the snake struck. And each story landed not like a wound reopened, but like a door cracked just enough to let light through, and the doctor, who had spent so long being asked to listen but not speak, now found himself offering pieces of his own memory. Not in great swells but in quiet currents. A river he once swam as a boy. A lesson about stillness from his grandmother. The smell of pine on the coat his uncle wore the day he left for boarding school, and in these exchanges, something passed between them that neither man named but both honored, a respect that didn't demand understanding to be real. And the girl, in her growing, became the bridge they both needed and the guide they hadn't known to look for. She moved between them like sunlight moves through branches, warming both without forcing either to change their shape, and each night she asked for a story, not always one from a book. Sometimes just a memory, a time the doctor was scared, a time her father cried, a time the world felt bigger than their hands could hold, and each story was a thread, weaving a tapestry around her heart that made her braver, wiser, more rooted in the kind of love that grows without asking permission. By mid-season, the doctor had begun teaching her more seriously, not just healing but seeing, how to look at a wound and also at what caused it, how to listen to someone's breath and also to what they weren't saying, and the girl, ever curious, soaked it all in, keeping a little notebook in which she sketched plants, wrote names phonetically, and sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, drew the doctor's face, her father's hat, the oak tree behind the barn with all their initials now carved side by side, hers first, then the doctor's, then the rancher's, the letters uneven but clear, like a trinity made from forgiveness, survival, and choice. In town, the murmurs had mostly faded, not because the people had changed, but because the story had, and they didn't know how to hold a story that didn't end with a wedding or a punishment, a story that simply kept unfolding in quiet acts of care. So they let it be, and slowly, some even returned, the blacksmith asking for a remedy for his arthritis, the schoolteacher inviting the doctor to speak on native plants, the store clerk offering a new shipment of salves with a nod that meant more than the words ever could. And through these small reentries, the town began to shift, not dramatically, not universally, but enough. And so the legacy grew not in grand declarations, but in patterns of love that repeated over time. In the way the doctor showed the girl how to mix tinctures with her eyes closed to learn scent. In the way the rancher began attending Sunday dinners at the neighboring homestead again, and correcting those who tried to reduce the doctor to just the man who saved her, saying instead, "He's family." And when one man raised a brow, the rancher met it with steel and said, "If that's a problem, you can eat elsewhere," and no one challenged him again. And then there was the day the girl fell, just a scrape. Nothing serious, but she ran to the doctor anyway, tears in her eyes, not from pain but fear. Fear that she had done something wrong. And when he knelt to look at her, she whispered, "What if I forgot what you taught me?" And he smiled, pressed his hand gently to her cheek, and said, "Learning doesn't mean never forgetting. It means always returning." And she cried then, not from pain, but from the relief of being allowed to fail and still be loved. And the rancher, watching from the porch, turned away, not to hide emotion but to give it space to breathe. And as the season turned again and the land shifted into golden shadow, the three of them stood under the oak tree, now taller than it seemed in spring, and the girl reached up to touch the initials they had carved, tracing them like a map, and said, "One day, people are going to ask who lived here." And the doctor said, "What will you tell them?" And she smiled, eyes bright as riverlight, and replied, that this was where people healed each other, not because they had to, but because they could. And the rancher, eyes on the horizon, nodded once and said, "That's a good story." And they stood like that for a while, no one needing to move, because sometimes legacy isn't in what you build, but in what you choose to carry forward, in what you leave behind, not in stone, but in memory, in kindness, in the quiet acts that ripple outward long after your voice is gone. And as the wind moved through the tall grass and the sun dipped low, and the world seemed to pause just long enough to listen. They knew, all three of them, that what they had forged here between medicine and mercy, silence and speech, passed. And promise was not just a home, but a beginning that others might one day walk into and know without explanation. That love had once lived here. The story didn't stay on the ranch, not because they wanted it to spread, not because anyone wrote it down or turned it into something marketable or loud, but because stories like this never stay still, they ride. The wind the way pollen does, invisible and patient, landing in the corners of other people's lives when they need it most. And it started with a boy from 3 towns over who came with his uncle, a wiry child with a limp and eyes too old for his age, who watched the girl ride bareback with a whoop of joy and whispered to the doctor when no one was looking, "Could you help my leg too?" And the doctor knelt, not because he thought he could fix what was wrong, but because he knew the boy needed someone to try, someone who wouldn't look away, and he spent 2 days working with him, teaching him stretches, making a salve that might ease the ache, but more than that he gave the boy hope, gave him someone who didn't call it broken, just different. And when they left, the uncle said, "I didn't expect this." And the doctor only nodded because it wasn't something you explained. It was something you lived, and they told others, and others came, not in droves, not loudly, but in that slow trickle that happens when word moves not through posters or telegrams, but through dinner tables and porch conversations, through mothers saying, "I heard there's a man out west who listens before he treats," or fathers whispering to sons, "There's someone who knows the old ways," not just the new names for things. And with every visitor, the ranch stretched a little wider in its purpose, not as a clinic or a sanctuary, but as something softer, a pause in the hard rhythm of life, a place where people were reminded that healing wasn't always about cures, but sometimes about being seen, being heard, being gently told, "You are not alone." And the girl, growing more capable every day, became part of it too, offering tea before it was asked for, fetching herbs without needing direction, telling younger children stories about birds that teach you how to breathe and plants that whisper warnings when stepped on. And though she didn't call herself anything special, the way she moved through each moment with attention, with warmth, began to shape how others treated her too, not just as a child, but as someone becoming, someone who might one day carry what the doctor was slowly passing on. The rancher, for his part, never tried to explain what their home had become. He simply kept the gates open, the fields clear, and when someone asked him if he was worried about so many strangers coming through, he said, "Not when they leave lighter than when they came," and that was enough. Letters began to arrive, not just from nearby towns, but from places neither of the men had been, questions, thanks, stories, all folded into paper and hope. And though not all of them were answered, each one was read, each one placed carefully. In a cedar box the girl called the wind chest, because she said, "These are words that came on the wind and need to be kept," and no one argued. And sometimes, travelers who passed through told them of rumors heard elsewhere, stories twisted in the retelling, how a Cherokee doctor had married into a powerful ranching family and brought medicine to the frontier, how a snakebite led to a ritual marriage that bound 2 feuding clans, how a man with no name healed children just by touching their foreheads, and the doctor would smile, not because any of it was true, but because all of it meant the story had legs, wings, had taken off in ways he could never control and never wanted to, because the real truth was quieter. And only the ones who needed it would ever find it. A girl with fire in her heart and a notebook full of pressed leaves, a rancher learning how to speak without raising his voice, and a man who once wandered with too much silence, now rooted in a place that had learned to listen. Miss Alda visited often now, no longer wrapped in layers of judgment, but in shawls of gratitude, sitting on the porch with the doctor and the girl, sometimes teaching songs, sometimes just humming them into the dusk. And when the girl asked her once if their story would be remembered, she said, "Child, stories don't wait to be remembered. They go where they're needed." And that became the way they lived, not trying to preserve something, just trying to live in a way that mattered and trusting the rest to the wind. Sometimes the doctor would sit by the creek in the evening, eyes closed, listening to the current, and he'd think of his grandmother's voice, not as something lost, but as something echoed now in the girl's questions, in the way the rancher laid tobacco at the edge of the fields before the first harvest, in the way strangers left gifts carved from stone or stitched from cloth without needing thanks. And sometimes when the girl sat beside him, sketching in the dirt or reading aloud from old plant guides, he'd feel something rise in his chest, not pride exactly, and not peace, but something more ancient, more vital, like a drumbeat carried in the bones, the knowledge that legacy is not what you leave behind, but what keeps moving even after your name fades. And he knew then that this place, this strange, hard-won haven, was now part of a much older story, one he hadn't written, but had somehow been chosen to continue. And so the whispers moved, on wind and word, sometimes twisted, sometimes true, but always carried with a weight that meant something. Real had happened here, something not measured in rituals or ceremonies or names, but in the way the land remembered kindness, in the way a child grew into herself with medicine in her hands and stars in her stories, in the way a man learned to let go of guilt and hold fast to love, and in the way a healer, once unsure if he belonged anywhere, now watched the horizon not in longing but in blessing, knowing the wind would carry what mattered, and everything else could be left behind. The moonlight returned, just as it had the night this story began, casting the ranch in the same pale silver it wore when the girl's life hung between breath and silence. Only now it touched different things, smoothed the lines of the oak tree with initials deeper and more weathered, traced the ridges of the doctor's face with quiet knowing, kissed the rails of the fence where herbs now bloomed stubborn and green even in late season, and settled across the porch where three figures sat, not huddled in crisis, but draped in calm, a calm hard one, and not taken for granted. And the girl, older now in ways you couldn't see unless you listened, leaned against the doctor's knee, sketchbook in hand, drawing the shape of the moon as it rose above the barn, her lines careful, practiced, and filled with something reverent. And beside her, the rancher tipped his hat back, boots crossed at the ankles, a man who had finally learned to let stillness speak without needing to break it with worry or pride. And the doctor, who once lived with the instinct to leave before belonging became dangerous, now stayed without needing a reason beyond presence. And as they sat in the hush of moonrise, the night wrapped around them like a memory made gentle by time. They said nothing for a long while, and then the girl asked, "Do you think the moon remembers that night?" And the doctor looked up at it, full, bright, unwavering, and said, "The moon remembers everything." And the rancher added, "But it only shines brightest when you're not trying to look too hard." And the girl smiled, folded her sketchbook, closed, and rested her head against the doctor's leg. And it was there, in that moment, that the story began to end. Not with a final act or sudden twist, but with a slow exhale, a soft return to breath that didn't carry urgency, only continuity. The house behind them was quiet now, lights low, windows open to the breeze. And inside were things left by those who had passed through, books from travelers, drawings pinned to the wall, jars of dried herbs with names written in 2 languages. And each one told part of the story without trying to claim it all. And on the far wall, in the small room the girl once called the sick room, there now sat a shelf filled with notebooks, her notebooks, filled with sketches and words and stories and questions she had gathered like seeds from every visitor. And one day, she said, she'd write them all down proper, not to be published, but to be passed on. And when the doctor asked her to whom, she said, "To whoever needs them." And that was enough. Outside, the stars began to scatter brighter across the sky, and the barn creaked in that familiar way old wood does when it's still holding strong, and the animals stirred in their sleep, the land moving with the kind of rhythm that doesn't call attention to itself but simply continues. And from the creek nearby came the soft rush of water still carving its way forward, even in the dark. And it was then the doctor stood, stretching. Slowly, bones and joints creaking like old branches, and walked down the steps barefoot, letting the dust cool his skin. And he paused at the edge of the yard, looking out over the fields, over the land that had once threatened to choke him with its judgment, but now held him like a home. And the girl watched him from the porch, eyes tracking him like moonflowers to the light. And the rancher, without looking, said, "Still thinking of leaving?" And the doctor turned, a small smile on his face, and replied, "Not tonight." And they let that be the end of it, because sometimes staying doesn't need to be declared. It just needs to be chosen, again and again, with each passing moment. And the girl, who had once been held in shaking arms with venom in her veins, now laughed easily, ate well, ran fast, and asked questions bigger than her years. And the man who had once been only her father was now her listener, her learner, her companion in questions he never imagined he'd ask. And the man who had once been only her healer was now her teacher, her storyteller, the steady breath behind every brave thing she dared to try. And together they had become something rare, not perfect, not legendary in the way towns like to twist truth into something easier to swallow, but real, enduring, woven into each other not by ritual or law, but by the thousand quiet acts of showing up, again and again, through fear and failure and forgiveness. And though the town still carried its scars, its silences, its tendencies to forget what doesn't flatter, there was no longer a need to fix it, only to outlast it, to be the story that continues in spite of the ones that try to erase it. And as the moon rose higher and the stars sharpened, the girl pointed to one near the edge of the sky and said, "That's mine." And the doctor looked up and replied, "Then let's name it." And they did not with ceremony, but with laughter, with memory, with something sacred made ordinary and back again. And the rancher leaned back and whispered, "I hope it remembers us." And the girl said, "It already does." And with that, the night settled, not as an ending but as a continuation. A reminder that stories like this never really stop, they just find new ways to be told. Through the curve of a leaf, the path of a creek, the warmth of a hand held too long and not long enough, and most of all, through moonlight returned not to haunt, but to bless, to shine again where it once shone in fear, now in love, now in belonging, now in the hush that follows the last line of a story you know you'll carry forever, even if no one else ever knows the words.